So it seems that you agree quite a lot, so that's a good introduction to Helge. So are you on now, Helge?
Yes, I'm here. Hello.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's a bit delay, I have the feeling, but that should be okay. Should I
Great.
just share my presentation right now?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good. Yes, thank you very much for this invitation. I would really love to be with you today, but yeah, as you all know, the corona situation is quite limiting traveling and makes it rather complex. So that's why I only join you online today, unfortunately. I have 4 points that I would like to present to you today, and it was very nice to see these first presentations with all these very nice projects in Copenhagen, and to see how kind of urban planning is kind of integrated with transport. My presentation goes a bit more into detail and focuses on pedestrians, as Otto already mentioned. My first point is, why is that important? Why do we look at pedestrians and urban planning for pedestrians when we talk about public transport? Actually, we do not do that very much. Why would it be important to do that? So, as we know, any public transport journey starts with a trip to a stop. I say here this is a walking trip, and then we have a waiting period shortly at the stop. Then we step on a bus or tram or metro, whatever it is, and we go by the means of public transport, and then that arrives again at the stop, and we have to walk again to arrive at our final destination. So any public transport journey comprises at least 4 trip sections. And when we looked on how do people actually access public transport, and these figures are very general, so it's on it's all types of public transport: train, bus, and metro, and so on. And we see that in cities, over 90% walk to public transport. So that is quite a large number. Bike and car is not so important. This is clearly here related to that we look at all forms of public transport, and there's a lot of bus public transport in that. So it's quite a high amount of walking here. And then this is data that comes from travel surveys, and what we find here as well is that the time that travelers spend in public transport vehicles is about 50 to 55% of the total travel time from door to door, and 45 to 50% of the travel time is on foot, actually. So people walk, people wait at stops, and so on. So it's the time so-called public transport users spend actually as pedestrians is quite relatively large. And then we looked at what do people remember from public transport journeys, and so we asked them freely, and they report openly without any restrictions or questions asked. And what they come up with is about 70% of the memories that they report on derive from the time that they spend as pedestrians. So, and that shows us that actually the walking part of a public transport journey is quite important in what we remember from a journey. So when we look at these figures together, we see that a public transport journey is also a journey on foot, and not kind of doing something for this part of a journey is really a problem for public transport, because we leave quite a large part of the journey unattended. So public transport users are pedestrians, but now when we understand, okay, walking is relatively important here, but what is it? What is walking? It's a bit a stupid question, because we can walk since we basically 1 year old, so we're all expert in it. So the thing is that we don't think about it anymore, and it's not so easy then really to get back to that and ask, what is it? Well, actually, it's not so difficult. Pedestrians are walking pedestrians have a low weight. They have no turning radius or swing radius. We can turn very spontaneously. We have no braking distance. We can stop from one step to the next. We can react quickly and intuitive, need little space. We can perform activities while we're on the way. I hope you can see this video that is going now on my screen. so that illustrates it, what we are as pedestrians and what walking is. So it's clearly something completely different than any mobility on wheels. And we also need to remember that walking is mobility, but it's also human behavior because it's so kind of integrated in our daily life. And walking is an outdoor mobility. So in cities, we walk outdoors. We don't have kind of something around us that protects us from the environment. It's basically our clothes, so that layer is very thin. And this environment influences how we experience walking. So walking results always in a sensory experience. So we have 5 sense organs that constantly collect information on the walking environment. And the problem is that we cannot switch off these sense organs. So they're constantly exposed to the urban environment if we want to or not. And psychologists explain how this works. So I said it again, we have 5 sense organs, and these 5 sense organs provide information to the human brain on what surrounds us. And it's quite important to understand here that 80% of this information is actually visual information. So what we see with our eyes is quite important how we experience walking and the urban environment around us. And in the next slide, I have a short video clip where we filmed pedestrians, and I would like to ask you to look on where people have their eyes. So where do people move their heads? Because what we see when the film starts, I hope you can see it as well at your screen, is that in environments where there's lots going on, as here in the center of Copenhagen, people move their heads, so they collect the visual information around them. They're obviously attracted by the environment around them. And here in another environment where there's lots of cars, boring facades, and nothing to look at, people basically look down on the pavement. Here's another example from the city center in Copenhagen where pedestrians turn their head frequently and they kind of catch up with whatever goes on around them. Here's another example, a seemingly boring environment, and there's nothing to see. And so pedestrians basically look down and they turn away from these visual environments. So the point of this short video is that we can actually see how people interact with their environment, and we can see where people attend to what surrounds them, and we can see where pedestrians turn away from the surrounding environment. So the question now is, how does the urban environment influence walking? Why is that important, and what happens when we walk? There are 2 things that are important. First is that the sensory information from the environment influences our emotions. And the second is it influences our perception of time, and as a consequence, how we perceive walking distances. Emotions, this is something, of course, that psychologists investigate, and this is one model that they come up with. And there are 2 axes or dimensions that are important to define emotions. The first is, the yellow one, is how much stimulation our brain receives, how much information are we kind of catching up from our environment. And the other dimension is if this information that comes up to our brain is pleasant or unpleasant. And then we can define emotions. High stimulation that is unpleasant is emotions like stress. High stimulation that is pleasant is like we are happy, we're excited, and low stimulation that is unpleasant, we're getting bored, and low stimulation that is pleasant, we manage to relax. So these 4 very fundamental different emotions we can define through this psychological model. And now the question is, can we investigate where pedestrians are highly stimulated and how they perceive this stimuli? And we've done that. I can't get into details here. We asked pedestrians we asked actually public transport passengers on their walking trip to tram stops, and asked them, was that pleasant or not? And the more difficult part is to investigate if pedestrians are stimulated. And you see again this little video that I showed before. We basically counted head movements, so we could actually quantify how much urban environments stimulate pedestrians and how much this stimulation differs. And when we put this data back into this psychological model, and what we find is not very surprising, but the new thing is that we could actually quantify the effect. In environments where there are cars and where pedestrians have to interact with cars, people have a tendency to be stressed. Stimulation goes very high and nobody's saying, well, this is pleasant. It's not very surprising. And because when we interact with cars, we're in danger. Cars are a fatal danger for pedestrians. So we have to pay attention. There's no choice here. And in like pedestrian streets, we see this high stimulation and people report this is pleasant. So here emotions like excitement, happiness, and so on are kind of stimulated. And in green environments, like in parks and so on, people manage to relax. So stimulation levels decline, and everybody is saying this is pleasant, we like this. And we know all these environments where walking is basically boring and tiring. There's little stimulation around and nobody's saying, well, this is very pleasant. So the second element was the experience of time. We all know that we do not experience time as a constant flow. Time can go fast and it can go slow. And the effect for walking is that when time passes fast, the distance appears shorter, and the walking speed that we perceive rises. So short time perceptions while walking have advantages because we experience distances as shorter. And also this has been investigated by psychologists, and they say low stimulation, then time stretches, and high stimulation, time gets short. And we see again, these are the same kind of factors involved here. So we had a measure for stimulation, and we could relate that to findings from psychologists. And we can basically set a figure, a percentage of how much perceived distances vary in different urban environments. And the extreme is, for example, a central urban square where lots of things going on, highly stimulating, that here walking distances appear 30% shorter, as in the other extreme, which is an underpath where nothing is going on, it's dark, there's not much to see, and stimulation levels drop to an extreme actually. So there's quite a big difference in the distance perception here. And again, this is not a soft factor. We can actually put a number on this, so we can measure these effects. And now then we've seen, okay, the walking environment is quite important to how we experience walking, and it is the perception of time, travel distance, and speed, and that has an influence on what we reach on foot. And in the first presentation, we talked about this 10 minutes city or 5 minutes city around around metro stops. And this is basically the effect. So we shorten perceived walking distances, and we're making public transport more accessible. And the second is emotions. So how is that important? This is, of course, very central to our choice of a travel mode, or if we choose to walk or not, or if we choose to walk and take public transport. If we have frequently negative emotions or experience with walking, we rather choose another mode of choice, and then we won't access public transport, at least not by walking, and that will have a big effect. So the quality of the urban environment influences walking measurably. Again, this is not a soft factor. We can actually start measuring these effects when we use findings from psychologists, for example. what is the potential for public transport? Now, speaking about urban environments and walking and so on, but what can we actually gain? What can public transport gain from these effects? As we have been in already, we were saying that walking distances to stops and stations are important. And they are, of course, important because they kind of define the number of potential public transport users that live within a walkable distance to the stop. There are, of course, many other factors involved that kind of influence how far people walk, but we know that the urban environment is important, as we have seen. And there is some research on this already from 1982, where they investigated very simple difference between car-dominated environments and pedestrian-oriented environments. And what they found is that in pedestrian-oriented environments, people walk actually 70% longer trips to public transport stops. This is a quite large number, and we were really thinking, can that be true? We ordered this study and we read it 3 times, and we said, well, they made everything right. There's nothing wrong with this study, so there must be something with this 70%. And then if we turn it to this simplified perspective, as you see on the screen now, when people accept 70% longer walking distances, the so-called catchment area around stops or stations increases, and actually quite a lot. It actually triples. Of course, this is a simplified kind of view on this, and the pedestrian network is kind of influencing this heavily and so on. But what we can understand is that we can increase the number that live in walking distances from public transport substantially when the walking environment actually works for them, and when it's attractive and practical to walk. So this is important, but the question again is, how do we get pedestrians to walk 70% longer distances? Even if we understand, yes, they walk longer, when we want to answer on that, and with urban planning, we need to understand, how is this taking place? Why do they walk longer? What can we do through urban planning to actually trigger this potential? And the first element I explained already is a bit complex. It's the subjective perception of walking distances and walking time and good emotions. Both elements together make up for about 30% of this 70%. That's a quite large factor. And that, of course, goes into architectural planning, landscape, urban design. All these elements kind of influence holistically these two things: good emotions and subjective and short perceived walking distances. The second element is possibilities to access services like shops and everything along the way to the stop. What we find is that when people have the possibilities to kind of access other services along a journey, for example, from work to home, they accept longer walking distances. And this is certainly because the travel becomes more effective. You basically save a journey when you can do things along the way. And as pedestrians, it's very simple to access, for example, a shop. You don't have to park a car, you don't have to lock a cycle, you just jump in, you get what you need, and you're out again. So it's very effective. And what we see is that people actually walk substantially longer, 15 to 25% longer walking distances for those who have possibilities to access services along walking trips to stops and stations. And the third element is relatively well known and often discussed. Of course, it's waiting times when we have to cross busy streets. We measured this effect, and when one street crossing, when you have 1,500 cars per hour on it, so that's a busy street, it's a 4-lane street, or probably rather a road. The waiting time on average makes up to 10 to 50% of a 300 meters walk to a stop. It's a short walking distances, but the time that all people who access public transport by walking, they wait on average 10 to 15%. The problem is when you access a stop, you need to be in time, and it could be that you just get red light and then you have to wait 30 seconds or something. So actually you have to account more than this percentage. So it goes up to 30% of a 300 meters walk when you want to cross a busy street. So that has a strong effect, and it's a very important effect to understand and to recognize, because public transport runs usually along busy roads and not along side roads, at least buses. The fourth factor is detours. There are several reasons that require to walk detours when we access public transport. One is very common. It's the footpath network, basically, that requires to walk detours, and we can't, of course, not access a stop in a direct line from where we live. The other one is relatively little discussed, but we found a quite large effect. It's the streetscape, or the layout of the streetscape, or in generally the layout of public spaces in the city that require to walk detours, as we see here an extreme case on this picture. So this effect is about -20 to -25%. So detours make up for quite long walking distances, actually. And in many cases, these detours are not necessary. So we can have missing links in footpath networks, or we build streetscapes that look like this example here on the table. Yes, sorry, that just came a bit light. In a footpath network is ±15%, so it actually has a quite big impact. So we can do a lot with planning good footpath networks. When we now just sum up these 4 elements and the percentages that we measured, we can see, we can see that these 70% are actually realistic. And another thing that we can understand from this that we can see is that we can do something with this, because all 4 points are subject to urban planning. So these are things that we deal with in urban planning, and we can actually start addressing these today. We don't have to wait until some technology is developed or something. It is of course not just straight away. Planning is a long-term process and so on, but when we are aware of these features or these 4 elements, we can actually do something with it, and we can extend acceptable walking distances through that. So good access to public transport is no hocus pocus. We can actually do something with it. And I've just very short conclusion. When we combine planning for pedestrians with public transport investment, we get more out, basically. Public transport is not cheap. It costs a lot of money. And when we kind of combine strategies where we say we invest in public transport, we also look at the details of the urban public spaces so that access to public transport is good. We get more out, basically, from the investments that we put into the public transport system. And I think, sorry. Yeah, and then a second conclusion that is more general. We understand that walking is an outdoor mobility. We also understood that public transport, or large part of public transport, is an outdoor mobility. And of course, we know cycling is also an outdoor mobility. So everything takes place in the public space. And when we understand how important the public urban environment is for all these sustainable forms of transport, we understand how important it is when we want to reduce car driving in cities. We need to have urban environments that fit to human beings, basically, because otherwise it will be difficult to support walking, public transport, and cycling, and to reduce car driving. I think that is what I had. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. I wonder if there are any on the Slido. No? Anyone from the audience? Yeah.
Any cues on how did you get to the numbers, to the last numbers you presented, the -15, the -25? Was it qualitative data and then just analyzed it quantitatively, or?
Could you hear the question?
Kind of half about.
Okay, so it was how which data foundation you had to draw these conclusions on.
Yeah.
The
Yeah. we had we worked quite a lot with observations. So we observed pedestrians walking to stops and walking from stops. That is quite laborious, but it delivers really kind of, you can measure exact times that they need to wait and so on. You can also measure reactions on environments. So we had a combination of observations, and the other element was, as I said, have been interviews. So, and then kind of combining these, we had different observation methods and combine them with interviews, and they come from both the results that you showed. For example, the results on access to additional services along transport journeys, we got that with interviews. So yeah, so there were, it's a combination of methods that we use to measure these effects.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for joining us from Norway.
Good, great. Thank you for the invitation.
Now